to this day, amazing and mysterious structures that are more than 1,000 years old continue to be found on our planet. Particularly striking are those artifacts and structures whose origins even the most authoritative archaeologists have not been able to fully unravel. Their secret lies not only in the materials they are made of or in unusual architectural forms, but also in technologies that seem to have been inaccessible to ancient civilizations. Add to this mysterious inscriptions that cannot be deciphered and incredible images engraved or carved on stone blocks, and we get real challenges for modern science. One of such unique places that holds many mysteries is the Plain of Jars, located in Laos in the province of Giong, bordering Vietnam. This place, which has no analogues, either in the region or in the rest of the world, has remained the subject of heated scientific debate for decades. The name Plain of Jars was given to it for a reason. There are about 60 archaeological sites on a vast territory of several dozen square kilometers, each of which is strewn with giant stone vessels that look like jugs. The total number of these artifacts exceeds 2,500. Each such jug is a vessel, carved from a solid block of stone, mostly cylindrical in shape, although there are also specimens resembling a parallelepiped or a truncated cone. The sizes vary from 50 centimeters to 3 meters in height. Some of them reach a colossal weight of up to 6 tons, and this raises a legitimate question. How did the ancient inhabitants of the region, without having either modern technology or a powerful transport infrastructure, manage not only to carve such monoliths from the rocks, but also to transport them over significant distances and then place them in strictly defined areas? Moreover, traces of intense heating are found in some vessels, and burial objects, ceramics, and human remains are found next to them, which allows some researchers to put forward a version about the ritual purpose of the jars. Perhaps they were used as a kind of sarcophagus or tombs for the noble dead. However, this is only one of the theories. Other scientists suggest that the vessels could have been used to collect rainwater, ferment alcohol, or store grain. Additional intrigue is added by the fact that similar artifacts were found not only in Laos, but also in neighboring countries. There is evidence of the presence of similar sites in Vietnam, and some researchers point to similar objects, even in India. However, despite the apparent coherence of individual hypotheses, there are serious doubts about their unambiguous reliability. And although certain theories regarding the origin of stone jars are interesting, they still remain more cultural interpretations than scientifically proven facts. Further complicating the study of the Plain of Jars is the fact that over the past century, a significant number of small artifacts found in the region have been removed from Laos and placed in private collections. These lost examples could potentially shed light on a number of questions. Were all the vessels exclusively large megaliths? Or was there also a tradition of creating smaller versions, perhaps for domestic or ritual purposes? The situation is further complicated by the regional characteristics of Southeast Asia, including an extremely humid, tropical climate that contributes to the rapid deterioration of organic and even stone materials. In addition, the region's history is replete with constant changes of cultures, peoples, and political entities, which further complicates the reconstruction of a coherent picture. As with other megalithic sites around the world, the Plain of Jars is left without written sources or obvious signs of a specific civilization to which it could be reliably linked. This turns the study into an archaeological quest, where the evidence is scattered and fragmented. It still remains a mystery who exactly when, and most importantly, why built such massive stone vessels in a remote mountainous area. Their purpose is even more controversial. On the one hand, Laotian peasants have an interesting belief. In ancient times, these lands were inhabited by giants, and it is they who are credited with building the huge jugs. These myths, although they seem naive, from a scientific point of view, are actually quite typical. Similar versions with giants. Gods or demigods can be found in almost every culture, trying to explain the origin of monumental structures, from Stonehenge to Baalbek and the Egyptian pyramids. Regardless of the location, the scale of megaliths always causes bewilderment. Why, possessing seemingly modest technologies, did the ancients build such bulky objects? On the other hand, there is a more mundane legend. Allegedly, a certain king named Kuncheng, after a major victory in battle, ordered the carving of stone jars to fill them with rice wine for a grand feast in honor of the triumph. This version sounds almost anecdotal. It is difficult to imagine that even the most extravagant monarch decided to create hundreds of 6-ton vessels at once solely for the sake of a banquet. However, like any legend, it may contain a grain of truth. Perhaps there really was an ancient ruling elite that used such vessels for religious, funerary, or cult purposes, and later real events were mythologized. The skepticism of researchers regarding both hypotheses is understandable. The legend of giants is a classic explanation that is resorted to when rational thinking is faced with the impossibility of explaining the technological achievements of the past. Indeed, the use of huge stone blocks for the needs of people living in the pre-industrial era seems too illogical, especially considering that later cultures of the region built from much lighter and more accessible materials, clay bricks, wood, and straw. Paradoxically, the only explanation that logically fits into the worldview of those cultures that existed in the region at the time of the first contacts with the jugs was their mythological interpretation. Without any written sources, historical evidence, or living tradition linking these structures to a specific civilization, local residents for centuries explained the origin of the megaliths in the spirit of legends about gods, heroes, and of course giants. These associations seem quite natural because before our eyes are gigantic, monumental vessels that in size, weight, and material do not fit into the usual life experience of people who used wicker baskets and clay dishes. In everyday life, the image of giants with superhuman strength and capable of moving and cutting multi-ton stones became the only possible explanation. However, surprisingly, the more mundane version, that the jugs were made by order of a king to store wine or other drinks, seems even more fantastic from an archaeological and logistical point of view. First of all, the use of heavy stone vessels, with a volume of several cubic meters and a weight of up to 6 tons, to store liquids is completely impractical. In antiquity, the Middle Ages, and even in the early modern period, no known society used megalithic containers to store food or drinks. It turned out to be much more practical and technologically advanced to use ceramics, wood or leather. Ceramic bathtubs, amphoras, and large jugs were easy to produce, transport, and maintain. In contrast, stone vessels required enormous expenditures of resources, tools, and labor. And that's not all. The logistics of such a project are striking in their absurdity. Imagine the need to hollow out, polish, and move a 6-ton jug in a mountainous area, where even modern cars have difficulty. But such jugs are not found in one place, but on dozens of sites, located at considerable distances from each other. Moreover, a considerable part of these sites are located on hills, which completely excludes the possibility that the jugs were made in one place and then delivered there. The opposite version seems more realistic. The jugs were made directly on site, which in itself speaks of a high technological culture and the long-term nature of the project. But why? Yes, perhaps some of these vessels, in later times, could really be used to store rice, wine, or for other purposes. For example, as burial urns, amulets, or ritual objects. However, the key here is in later times. That is, even if the legendary Kunchun or another local ruler once really used these jugs for a utilitarian purpose, then most likely this was a rethinking and adaptation to the existing mysterious heritage and not the original idea. But perhaps the most striking part of this mystery is the geometry and layout. The arrangement of the jugs does not lend itself to chaos. On the contrary, it seems that they form a certain system. As modern research shows, the jugs are not simply scattered chaotically around the area. They are grouped into certain areas, each of which differs in density, configuration, and mutual position of the vessels. Moreover, there is a version that these areas may have an astronomical or technical purpose. For example, some researchers have put forward a hypothesis that the jugs could have served as elements of some ancient device, associated with ritual or even navigational functions. Additional intrigue is provided by the discovery of stone lids, found on some sites. This proves that at least some of the vessels were indeed used as containers, closed from external influences. However, this does not mean that the main purpose of all the jugs was to store liquid. Well, let's move on to the next version. It states that the jugs were created to collect rainwater, and they were located along the route of trade caravans. At first glance, the version is beautiful and even logical, because in a hot climate, access to water is vital. However, upon closer examination, this hypothesis has a number of serious flaws. Firstly, rains in Laos are not uncommon,